Although I am an active member of the Church of Satan, I do not speak for the Church of Satan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this installment, episode 20 of the Undertaking Satan podcast. If you haven't listened to episode 19, I suggest you go back and do that now or right after you listen to this one because the topics are heavily related. And I am going just a little bit fanboy here. Grendal is an Electric Hellfire Club fan. We have Reverend Thomas Thorn on today, musician extraordinaire, a man of many talents. We're going to get into that. Devil's Night is coming up in October down in Tampa, Florida. Everything's going to be linked in the description. We're going to talk about that heavily as well. But yeah, that sounds like quite the event that the Electric Hellfire Club is going to be involved with. So without further ado, Thomas, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks for asking.
Well, thank you so much for taking the interview. I just wanted to kind of talk about my experiences as a fan of the Hellfire Club. It really kind of started when I started to ritualize. So you guys, you've been putting out music for a long time. Actually, you started putting out music when I was 3 years old. And so by the time I got into Satanism, or found out I was a Satanist really was in my early teenage years, right? Like 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there. I started doing my first rituals, and I was a big metalhead kid, right? Think about your trip pants wearing, band shirt, hot topic geek back in the day. That's what's pretty much defined little Grendel at that period of my life. And I was into bands, Rob Zombie, Marilyn Manson, kind of all the new metal stuff that was going on at that time period. And when I started to ritualize inside of the chamber, I tried to use that music as part of it and realized it didn't really work. So that led me to a rabbit hole where I was trying to find true satanic music. And then I started with Anton LaVey's keyboard playing. I came across you guys online. To this day, I still use Invocation, the first song off of your first album, well, the first half of the first song off the first album, as an invocation to my rituals. Literally, that's how I put my mind in that space right before I read the invocation to Satan. So, literally, every Grendel ritual that's been worth a fuck, you guys have started. I guess my first real question for you is, are you excited about Devil's Night? And can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. I had very mixed feelings at first. 9 years ago, we did a reunion show, 25th anniversary. I literally walked away from it going, this was a reminder of everything that I walked away from. Dealing with promoters to substance abusing band members to just all the stuff that as a grown up, I didn't want to have to deal with anymore. Anytime anybody's suggested anything like, wouldn't you like to? Nope, nope, absolutely not. Not going there, not doing it. It's testimony to my friendship with Reverend Andy Howell that that he can say, now just hear me out here. This is a completely different approach. And I will preface what I'm saying. There have been some great people who have spent time in the band and even with the reunion show, the people who were remarkable in the way they showed up, did what they did. There were other sides of it too, people not showing up, people showing up but not being there. But this current incarnation is, as we say in Florida, it's flow grown. It's raised here in Florida. I'm 60 years old and I go to band practice every week. That's a completely different animal for me. And even with Hellfire Club, we used to joke and say, oh, we get paid to practice. That's the first three shows or things like that. But when you spend 11 years on the road, you pretty well know the songs. It's all new. We're doing different renditions of things. We're attacking it with different instrumentation, different attitude. And yeah, I'm actually excited about it. I think that for the first time in over 30 years, I'm enjoying music. I'm excited about music. I want to do more. I'm definitely going to do another record at this point. And hopefully the guys that are working with me in this incarnation of the band are going to stick with it and, be part of that. But either way, I'm moving forward. It's the biggest version of the band that's ever existed. There are 6 other people other than me that are playing. It's big, it's hard, it's heavy, but it's exciting. So
That answers one of the questions, at least partially, that I had coming up for you. Anyone who's kind of familiar with the Electric Hellfire Club's history and listened to their music, where it started and then where it kind of ended and where you guys currently are is completely different. And I'll kind of go back to my story. One of the reasons that the early stuff works so well, like in a ritualistic satanic setting inside the intellectual decompression chamber, at least in my opinion, it's very visceral, but it's done mostly on keyboard with synth, with sampling, and it just adds a lot of different layers. That's what I loved about it. It brought a different element in there. And then all of a sudden we get to 2000, specifically the Millennium album. I got a completely new taste of what that was. I was, listening to the old stuff, using it for ritual. All of a sudden, one day I dug into the newer stuff, and I was like, "Wow, this almost sounds like Rob Zombie-esque at some points. This is really cool." The electric stuff was still there, obviously, but the tone changed dramatically. Can we continue to see that with this new incarnation?
the thing that I'll say is that if you really dissect every record, they're all completely different. Now, there are common threads that run certainly through the first 2. For instance, I remember handing in the completed recording for the first album, and Brian Pereira, the president of Cleopatra, calls me up and he said, "Why isn't Incubus on this record?" And I said, "Because I don't want to have a sophomore slump and I'm saving it for the second record." You look at someone like Guns N' Roses, they've been playing for 15 years. They're an overnight sensation. And if you could see, I'm making quotation marks in the air. An overnight sensation that took 10 to 15 years to happen. They take all their best songs, slam them into one disc, and then it's huge. Everybody's excited. And then 8 months later, the record company's saying, "Okay, write another one of those." And it doesn't work like that. Particularly, some of your best material is refined by playing it live. You say, "Oh, what we should do is we should chop that one verse or move the bridge to the beginning or something like that," because they understand not just the way that the song works musically, but the way that it affects the audience that's listening to it by playing it in front of people. You lose the opportunity to do that by your third record. For me, by the time that I was doing my third record, my third full length, I had other things to worry about. Half the creative process behind the band was gone. My best friend had gotten killed. So everything that the mechanics of the band shifted entirely. It was fully on my shoulders, but there really weren't any other voices that were particularly loud enough to influence the direction the band was going. So
And just as you said there, I do want to mention it, just because it's one of my favorite albums. Is Doctor Love, right? And you just mentioned your best friend who passed away. I assume that's who we're talking about.
correct.
Oh man, I got to say right here, the cover of Doctor Love that you guys did is probably, and I'm not lying to you, I'm not blowing smoke up your ass. It's probably my favorite cover I've ever heard, because if you know what that album was about, which most people did, and you know what it was dedicated toward, you guys have original stuff on there, and then 3/4 of the way down, the playlist, you have Doctor Love. It's a cover that takes on a completely original meaning because of where it was placed and what it was about. And then obviously your guys' delivery was spot on. I just wanted to mention that. Sorry, it's kind of an off track type of thing, but
No, it's great.
no,
I appreciate you saying so. He and I had made all the plans to do that record. We had the guy who we had worked in the studio with, and he said, "Look, I want to build a studio. I've got this building." We went to Milwaukee. We looked at the building, big empty warehouse building, and he said, "This is what I want to do. This is what I want to put over there, over there, over there. This is how much money I need. If you can come up with that money, you can basically spend as much time as you want making this record." And I'm like, "Wow, that's a pretty major deal." And we gave him half the money up front, and then he got killed. So I had money down on the studio, and I delayed recording I want to say by only 1 month, because I had a lot of things going on. But the thing was, is that retrospectively, just kind of doing an autopsy of my emotional state at that time, there was part of me that when somebody dies that young, that tragically, that instantaneously, I mean, I had had friends murdered, I'd had friends kill themselves, I'd had friends die of cancer, but the car accident thing was just like all of a sudden gone. We were right there. And to me, if I could somehow move the band to the next level, like, be profoundly successful, it would, in my mind, have vindicated his death. Or at least that's what I was thinking. That's the direction that I was going. I wanted to prove to myself, to him, that it wasn't all for nothing. That influenced what I did for the next probably 7, 8 years.
You just said that every record's different, but just kind of for that major change that I felt through your guys' music, that record kind of felt like at least the starting point of that major change. Is that fair to say?
It's interesting because you look at the personnel shifts, and Ronnie Vallejo, who was the original guitarist, who also passed away recently, he was a metal guitarist. He was from like the Queensryche tradition, where technical metal, and he hated the mix of the first album because the guitars were so low. But even with the guitars being so low and the electronics being so prominent, all the people in quote unquote industrial circles hated it because there were too many guitars. Even Klaus Larson from Leatherstrip, Brian Pereira said, "Oh, I played it for Klaus," and he said, "Too many guitar." 3 years later, everybody's doing it. Ronnie left literally after the release party, on Halloween night of that record, and basically made some ridiculous demands and said, either I get this and this and this, chauffeurs, limousines, whatever. He thought that the rock stardom that we weren't really experiencing was going to mean to him, and we were just like, okay, dude, see you later, sorry. And the guy that we hired in was Richter Ravensbrook, and he played on, it's not really a remix record, it's kind of reimaginings called Satan's Little Helpers. There are two new songs on there, but he's the guitarist there. But then he couldn't handle the touring that we were doing, so he's like, "Oh well, I'll just be your studio guy." And I'm like, "Yeah, it doesn't work like that." And we got Gregor Mephisto, who plays on Kiss the Goat. When we were doing Calling Dr. Love, there are a couple songs that Chains, Chuck Lenahan from the band Crumbsuckers in New York, played for Genitorturers at the time, and we toured with them. And he volunteered to come out and play on some songs. So he played on Book of Lies, and I'm trying to think a couple other things on there. And Greg got pissed off that we had another guitarist that was adding flash to it, and he walked out before he even went into the studio. So I had to get another guitarist while we were in the studio. But Paul Kniever, the engineer that built the studio, he said, "You need to call Ricky." And I'm like, "Dude, we didn't really exactly end on the best note." And to his credit, Rick had sent me a letter after Shane died, and just kind of like, I know we haven't really spoken, but dude, really sorry, everything like that. And we ended up talking on the phone. I said, "Well, why don't you come down and play a couple songs, and we'll see what happens." He was in the band for, again, on and off. I guess that's the thing, is that some of the people talking about this show, they're like, "Well, who's going to be in the band?" And I'm like, "Well, there probably aren't going to be a lot of familiar names, but I can guarantee you one thing, and that is the guy who's on every single song on every single record and has been at every single show the band ever played will be there." It really was intended to be a club. It was going to be the club, and we were going to have not necessarily a continuously revolving lineup, but there was going to be opportunity for people to walk in and out, rather than it to be so detrimental to the band. We did reach a point where I was completely unfazed by anything. I mean, the day before I met Anton LaVey, half the band quit after a show in San Francisco. you know it was funny because I was still sort of shell shocked. Blanche Barton looking at me going, "Well, how are you doing?" I'm like, honest or no, how's the tour going? I said, well, right at this moment, not that well. Half the band quit last night. And she just looked at me and she said, oh, powerful men always have that effect on people. Just kind of like she was unfazed by it and no question in her mind. Probably a more ordinary, a more average person would say, well, what on earth are you going to do? Are you going to, be able to finish the tour? Are you going to go home, or what are you going to do? No doubt in her mind that it was just going on, and it did. So
Just because you mentioned it, I have to ask, meeting Anton LaVey for the first time, it's one of those things that with every Satanist who had the ability to do so, there's never been a bad story. So can I hear yours on your impressions of him and things like that?
there were a bunch of things I wanted to ask him. All the questions that I had were answered within the first 5 or 10 minutes of talking to him. I had really been sold this idea that, oh, well, Anton LaVey's this doddering old man on his deathbed. And he was this big, strong, vibrant guy that crushed my hand with his handshake, had a million stories. And I think that consummate storyteller, remarkable musician, but just sitting in the talking with him, because he also listened, and he was interested. He knew things about what I'd done. I don't know, maybe he was briefed by Blanche for 15 minutes before he walked into the room with me. It doesn't matter if that's the case, because the thing is that he had it all in context, and he understood who I was and what I was doing. The most meaningful things to me are things that he intended to do. And that is that before I left, and we were there for, I want to say, about 4 hours, and it was starting to get light when we left their house. He stopped me, and he and I are standing in the doorway, and he takes my hand in both of his, and he looks at me, and this is after he has just like told me, made me a priest, said, you understand how this works, that you join this organization at the rank that is relative to the accomplishments that you've made in the real world, and you've accomplished a lot. It's another story for another time about the fact that I really didn't think that I was the right guy, and he disagreed. But he takes my hand in both of his, and he looks at me and he says, Thomas, I just want you to always remember I'm very proud of you. And he's looking me right in the eye. And whether he did that dime store psychological profile of me that says, oh, here's a guy that wishes that his dad had been more proud of him or something like that, which isn't really who I was. But I think that at their heart, there are a lot of people that do want that sort of acknowledgement. But this is Anton LaVey. This is a guy that since I was 11 years old, I knew who he was impressed by what he'd done, and he's looking at me and saying that. But the thing is that while I'm saying that he was strong and vibrant, he was sick, and he knew that he may never see me again. And if he didn't, the thing that I'm always going to remember every time I think of him is the ASL was proud of me. I've been through it with some of the people around here, and I mean there was a time when there were people saying, "Well, that's not really a priesthood. That's an honorary priesthood." The fact that people who are Church of Satan members would actually say something like that. Oh yeah, an honorary priesthood given by Anton fucking LaVey. You're not insulting me, you're insulting him by diminishing that. At the end of the day, any question as to whether or not it was deserved was removed when Magis Gilmore elevated me to Magister. And people say, well, if you're Magister, why don't you go by Magister? And the reason for that is, quite frankly, because there are a whole lot of people out there that when you call them Reverend, they say that would be Magister to you. But if you look in the literature, it says that Reverend can be used by anybody up through the Magister level. I don't have anything to prove to people outside or inside. And I've been here for a long, long time. I have known the Magis and Magistra since long before they assumed the positions that they had, and I've stood by their side through the whole thing.
For me, a person who is, was not around during the things that you just spoke about, there, it's a gem for me to hear kind of the history and the inside tracks on things like that. Certainly, there had to be growing pains with the band, also with the Church of Satan. Thank you so much for that. I did want to just, again, this is selfishly me again, because I get
Sure.
to bend your ear for a while.
That's what the religion's about, man. So,
Exactly. So yeah. So a little tongue in cheek there, but yeah. So I wanted to ask you about a couple of my favorite songs, if I could.
sure.
Probably my all-time favorite is Black Bus. There was always this idea of San Francisco being the flower-powered destination back in the time of Anton LaVey. There was also other people, especially back in his time, who were trying to lump him in kind of with the hippie generation and things of that nature, which of course he detested. So with that song, to me, was very much like, hey, get on the big black bus and we'll show you what you don't see about San Francisco. It had that kind of feeling and that vibe of, you're going to see the seedy underbelly of what's already a seedy underbelly, and it's going to be awesome. Am I completely off on that?
That's a continuous thread through the thing. I was born in 1964, so the Manson killings were a big deal as I was growing up. It's funny because, my parents were establishment people, but my dad had, he was a professor of law, of criminal law at Loyola University, but he had long hair. There was this whole thing with how the whole hippie movement really got co-opted, and all the styles became the prevalent styles that were being promoted. And my mom was making macrame belts and everything like that, and the Manson thing happens, and all of a sudden everybody backs up and is like, holy crap, these hippies can be incredibly like violent and dangerous. And likewise, my buddy Shane's parents, they were actually hippies, and they hitchhiked all over the country, and they had hitchhiked out to California when the Manson killings happened, and they basically walked home to Wisconsin across the country, because it used to be, they said, you'd hitchhike, and families with station wagons picked up hippies, and they'd have extra sandwiches in their cooler so that they could like hear you like sing songs and tell them about peace and love and everything like that. But they said nobody would give them a ride on the way home. I think that this is like a fulcrum point for the nation's psyche. When it's changing, it's breaking, it's all these things are going on, and there wasn't just a seedy underbelly; it was all interconnected. And as a guy who, for the longest time, I was a real student of certain events, times. The Manson killings was something, and also remember, this is before there was a band called Marilyn Manson that we were writing these songs. And Manson and me kind of vibed on the fact that we came to the same place. He was Marilyn Manson and the Spooky Kids, and I think there was like a cassette they did where they were all on the bus. He even did an album called Holywood, and Holywood is the way that Hollywood Productions was misspelled on the side of Manson's black bus. It was missing an L because the Manson family were not rocket scientists. You read all these books, and I was into this whole thing of paradoxical juxtapositions. I want to be this deep, dark, satanic band, but I'm going to use fluorescent colors instead of like black and white and red on everything. And instead of like jagged, spidery lettering, I'm going to use, stuff that could have been at Woodstock or at its creepiest, maybe in Famous Monsters magazines. Look at some of this stuff, and by reading all these books and learning all these things, you read Helter Skelter, the Bugliosi book, and there's mention of the fact that in one of the victims, Jay Sebring, who was hairdresser to the stars, they had searched his house and they found hood and whips and things like that. And it didn't really go into any detail when it said hoods. It could be like zipper bondage hood where you're doing sensory deprivation. But then years later, I read one of Sammy Davis Jr.'s two biographies, and he's talking about when he's flirting with the whole satanic thing and painting his left pinky fingernail red and waving it around on Phil Donahue and things like that. He gets invited to a party and the party he's describing as a ritual, and there's a bunch of people crowded around, and there's a naked girl on what appears to be an altar, and there's a guy that's doing whatever sounds sort of like he had taken acid and watched Rosemary's Baby or something like that. The long story short, the guy who's the high priest, when the thing ends, comes over to him, takes his hood off his head, and it's Jay Sebring. I'm like, holy crap, dude. Whether it was like just a swinger sex cult that was using the trappings of satanic ritual to like get off or whatever, all these weird things that Manson would say about how all these people, all these Hollywood people are into the same things that we are, and they're doing all this crazy stuff, and it's all interconnected. Whether you call that the same Satanism that LaVey codified or that we practice, it's its inbred cousin. If it's not the same thing, it's got a relation to it. So for me, there was all that crazy darkness, all these weird different things that Bobby Beausoleil is spray painting a goat's head fluorescent pink and mounting it on the hood of the black bus. And I'm just like, dude, this is wild. I want to write a song about this. And we made a concerted effort for our shows to be immersive. There was no band that was the same size we were that was bringing their own light show on stage, and it was completely synchronized with our stuff. And because of the fact that we were running sequences and had MIDI outputs and everything, we had opportunity to do that. And just as long as the place could contain fog, you were somewhere else the second that the show started.
You talked just about things intertwining and just, everything kind of leading to the other. And that experience that you just mentioned there that you try to provide for your live audiences, I feel like that's why your music translates so well to the ritual chamber. What you just said there. And then also, I think the keyboards have this odd importance, I would guess you would say. Maybe it's just in my subconscious, it feels religious, because I grew up with pipe organs and things of that nature. That's just kind of connected in my mind there.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, that totally makes sense, but it's no coincidence that it's called the Electric Hellfire Club. For me, and we can talk about this later, but one of my first jobs was working at a funeral home, and from the time that I first started seeing dead bodies, I started getting this idea about what's different when somebody's dead. That the Christians and other religions call it a soul, whatever the case. There's something missing, and it's the energy. We're matter and we're energy. To me, the energy is electrical in nature, and when you start to follow that trail of breadcrumbs, you think of it as being electrical. Why is it that in Frankenstein, what animates the corpse is lightning? It's electricity, installs the spirit and brings life. And I think that electricity as spiritual energy has been a running theme with the stuff that we've done. And when you can translate electricity into sound and synthesizers, that's exactly what they're doing, is they're using mechanical devices to translate electricity into sound. It makes complete sense for it to be part and parcel of ritual, and to understand that those different sounds and wavelengths and the oscillations and all those things relate to what's going on in our conscious and subconscious when we're trying to ritualize.
I failed to realize it. You just told me before we hopped on for the interview that, one of your first jobs was in a funeral home. And obviously that's what I do now. And that for me clicks, and it makes so much sense, just because when I see funerals, to me, it's almost like people are attempting to replace I'm using quotation marks here that you can't
Sure.
see, the soul of the dead person with the music,
Right.
because like you said, something has been lost and it's very apparent in that room. And in a way, it's like I'm a big kind of Greek nerd. It's almost like the Pygmalion effect, right? Or the Frankenstein effect, like you just said. You're trying to bring the person back to life with music, and I feel that in the embalming room with the Pygmalion effect, which is basically the idea of trying to bring something back to life, but you can't.
Right.
When I embalm, I make this person look a hell of a lot better than they were when they first got on my table. And I'm very proud of myself and get that instantaneous moment of, aha, I did it. I feel like Victor Frankenstein. And then that's a very short moment because you realize this is a dead person and that's the best that you can do. Being exposed to the funeral industry in your capacity, even, just kind of as a helper around the funeral home, do you feel that that kind of just informed the rest of your life, your music, that sort of stuff?
It did. Because that's the first place that I started seeing dead bodies, and they looked fake to me. They didn't look like the person lying there asleep. When people say, "Oh, they look so peaceful," to me, they don't. They just don't look like that person. And I don't care how much of an artist you are in embalming and making them look exactly like their high school picture or even better than they've ever looked in real life. They just don't look like the person to me. And that's what I started to think about. I'm like, well, why don't they look like them? There's something else that is missing. It's the fire, it's the aliveness, it's the energy. So yeah, I mean, I was 15, 16 years old, 16 years old. They started letting me drive the hearse, and for those out there in podcast land who don't know, I don't know what they're like now, but a Cadillac hearse at that time had a 500 horsepower engine. So when I had to take a body to the airport and dropped it off, and suddenly there was a tremendous lack of weight in the back of that hearse, I could open that thing up on those country roads in Wisconsin, and a 500 horsepower hearse can go pretty darn fast. So
Yeah, I can attest also, we've all been in that situation where we need to be somewhere in a hurry and
yeah,
we've got schedules to keep. Hearses or coaches is, I guess, the proper term. They're always created from the kind of top of the line vehicles to show respect, right? So they always have pretty good engines in them and can be fun to drive. So I can attest to that as well. One of the big goals of my channel is to dispel a myth that Satanism is all about death, because of course we know that it's not. It's completely the opposite. It's all about the lust for life. For me, confronting death is a huge part of that. I see death every day and I work with it and I see the impact of when people just never think about it before. So I always ask, have you given any thoughts to your services? What music would you want played is specifically the question I really want you to answer.
so that's changed a lot. So again, like I said, I'm 60 years old. I've had a knee and hip replacement for the hip replacement came first, but I got it when I was 38 years old. It was some of the bad living that I did as a rock musician. This guy Mike Amato, who was the road manager for both. I first knew him when we used to go out on the road with Typo Negative, and he later went out with Marilyn Manson a lot. But he comes up to me after our show one night and he goes, "What's that last song that you guys are doing?" I said, "It's called Fall from Grace." And he says, "Yeah, he's an awesome song." And that thing where you're like, you come off the drum riser and you like, land on your knee and the strobe lights on and everything like that. I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Really, really dramatic." And I'm like, "Thanks." He goes, "But I'm going to tell you that by the time you're 40, you're going to have some serious problems with your knees if you keep doing that every night." My response to him at the time was, "Well, it's probably a good thing I'm not going to live that long then." I had no intention of making it that far. It wasn't like I was going to take my life or anything like that, but it was really live fast, die young, leave a good looking corpse. And I didn't really have a long term plan. I didn't see it playing out like that. Things changed. And here I am. Back then, I was all like, "Oh well, I want a low tombstone with a hole in it with iron pentagram in there, and it should say 'I have gone where violence is golden,' stuff like that." Which I look back on, I'm like, seriously, dude, like any cemetery would have let you put that in there. Beyond that, it was songs that were going to be about the music. And the thing is that music's great and everything like that, but where I am at this juncture in life is different. I'm a 60-year-old guy with a 12-year-old son. Since I was a young man working in a funeral home, I've understood that funerals are for the living. They're not serving the dead. They're best case, they're um, easing the transition for the people left behind. So the thing for me is like, okay, so what's going to ease my wife or that kid's transition? And I think that part of that is for them to make the decision, because it's not my show. And it's just like, what song makes them think of me? What song is the most meaningful thing for them? Because they're the ones that are going to be there and listening while they have to, like, do that thing where they stand in a line and shake people's hands like somebody graduated or something like that, or worse yet, the party afterwards where they serve those little dry ham sandwiches we used to call the death party. So I think that while I've thought about, can I envision the perfect funeral? I don't think that's my place. I think that that part of the process and by necessity falls on those left behind to make those decisions. And I think there are things that you do need to decide and you do need to take care of in order to make things easier. Like, okay, so what do you want to do with my body? I'm sitting at a desk and my dad's ashes are in a box at the edge of my desk because my dad wants to be buried at sea. The next time that I'm gonna like go out on the ocean. Well, it's been a long time since I've been on the ocean, and I know that my dad would be like, "No, not the Gulf, the ocean." At some point, I will sure that I honor that wish. It was important for me for a number of years to have somewhere that I could go and just like, I don't want to say I was like necessarily talking to Shane, but where I was communing with who and what we had been and honoring his memory and standing there in the snow and putting flowers down and looking at his headstone, which had a keyboard engraved in one side and had a portrait of him, but it didn't say Reverend Dr. Love because, that would be suggesting that he was somehow involved with some kind of clergy or something like that. So it just said Dr. Love. And I'm like, well, doesn't that suggest that he's like, you know, either got a PhD or is serving in some medical capacity? But not that I said that to him, but stuff that I thought. But I think that it would be nice. It's surprising and humbling to me to find out how many people actually give a shit when I say, okay, I'll do a show. I will put the work in and I will woodshed this stuff with a handful of real musicians for 6 solid months to make sure that we do this justice and make it worth your while to come here and experience this band's music. Believe me, it will be the Devil's Night show will be more than worth it for people because there's no sequence running, there's no backing tape running, there's none of that stuff going on. It's all being recreated with real instruments in a way that I always wanted to, but was such a tremendous amount of work. But here I am, way too late in the game doing it for a one-off show.
That being said, I think it's going to be one hell of a one-off show. After talking to Reverend Howell and then talking to you, I don't think there's any way that I could miss this show, to tell you the truth, other than the fact that I've always wanted to see you guys play live, and of course, I've never been able to do so. Yeah, I'm very excited for it. It's going to be a wonderful experience, and thank you for putting it together on your end. I'm sure Reverend Howell will listen to this. Thank you again for putting everything together to do this. Man, it's a very exciting thing. I'm kind of glad that I started asking for interviews from you guys at this time because it's so exciting.
Yeah, and and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that this isn't just a rock show. Reverend Howell has really been stepping up his game as far as, stepping into some big shoes within the church and its role in a society that increasingly doesn't want us to exist. Devil's Night is, we're going to finish, and then Reverend Howell is going to perform a full black mass on stage. So, and this is something that it didn't, he didn't just pull it out of his ass. Sorry to be crass like that. This is something that he and Magis Gilmore worked on and talked about, and yeah, that there are more than a few tips of the hat and borrowings from the work of the COS founder Anton LaVey, but at the same time there's a modern take on it, and I think that dare I say, any self-respecting Satanist would be missing out if they didn't show up to at least partake in that aspect of the event.
Yeah, I completely 100% agree. I am just so invested on multiple levels, just as a fan of the Electric Hellfire Club, obviously, as a Church of Satan active member, obviously, and then as a ritualist or a funeral director who's somebody who builds rituals on a daily basis, and really getting to dissect Reverend Howell's brain on episode 19 and talk about that ritual a little bit that he and Magus Gilmore are crafting. Man, yeah, a lot there. It's an exciting time to be a Satanist for sure. And then you're adding it all into the Halloween season, and Grendel's highest holiday is very much around that time as well. So the stars are aligning for me personally. I think for a lot of people out there, I mean, get out there, see this show, see you guys play, see the ritual, be a part of it. I have never been a part of a like large scale COS ritual. I'm hella excited to use a millennial term. So, yeah, again, thank you. I appreciate it.
Certainly, certainly.
Well, sir, that kind of exhausts my list of stuff that I had to ask you, but certainly the floor is yours. Is there anything else that you've got going on other than stuff we've already talked about? Anything else you just wanted to throw in there that the discussion might have jogged in your mind so far?
We covered a lot, and I always joke about the fact that you put a quarter in me, you get about $8 back. So that I certainly have given you more than you probably expected on some of this stuff, and hopefully not too much more than was actually useful. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's an interesting time, and I think that it's important for us to not necessarily be more vocal and visible, but to be more determined in what we think, what we believe, and what we do. And I think there are opportunities where we can stand side by side to reaffirm that commitment with each other. Wow. No time like the present to be doing that. So, I look forward to meeting everybody that I haven't met before who comes out. What day is your birthday?
It's the 27th, actually.
That's real close. So
Yeah,
very
yeah.
nice. I'm looking forward to that. And I'm honestly, it's not like I haven't been doing a ton of stuff since the last show that we did, but my creative energies have been channeled into other areas, and it's interesting to be coming up with all this stuff, and to be talking to these guys and saying, we should really just do a completely different version of this song instead of trying to replicate any of this stuff and saying, wow, that sounds really good. You know what, let's make a recording of that. And we've been talking about creating some collectible vinyl and things like that really commemorate this moment in time. It's the 30th anniversary of our album Kiss the Goat coming out, so an apropos time to be celebrating a black mass, and I hope that people come out. We have an opportunity to celebrate this stuff together.
Awesome. Well, I think that puts a wonderful pin in it. Again, thank you so much, Thomas, for your time tonight. We're going to sign off here. We'll see you in the next installment. Bye now.
You have been listening to the Undertaking Satan podcast. To get in touch, please head on over to the Undertaking Satan landing page, which is undertakingsatanpodcast.com. When you get there, go ahead and click the Email Grendal button. If you're looking for more information on Satanism in general, please visit churchofsatan.com. This episode is copyright 2025.